By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe had consumed nearly every continent, every ocean, every family. The once unstoppable German war machine was now retreating, beaten back across the fields of France, the mountains of Italy, and the skies above the Rhine. In the mud-filled trenches and shattered villages, thousands of German soldiers began to realize that the Third Reich's promise of victory had turned to ash. They were young, many barely 20 years old. Some had fought on the Eastern Front, witnessing horrors that would never leave their minds. Others were conscripts, teachers, factory workers, and farmers drawn into a war they no longer understood. When the Allied forces, Americans, British, and Canadians, advanced after D-Day, entire divisions of German troops were surrounded and forced to surrender. By May 1945, more than 400,000 German prisoners of war were being held by the United States. They came not as invaders now, but as captives, men whose fate had shifted from conquering the world to simply surviving it. The journey to captivity often began in a field somewhere in Normandy or the Ardennes. After capture, the prisoners were processed by Allied military police, searched, photographed, and tagged with identification numbers. Many expected to be executed. They had been told by Nazi propaganda that American soldiers were brutal, that no German would live long in enemy hands. But what they found was something entirely different. American guards handed out cigarettes, hot coffee, bread. Medical corpsmen treated wounds without distinction between friend or foe. Some POWs wept silently, unable to understand why their enemies were showing them mercy. Soon, long convoys of trucks and trains carried them to ports: Le Havre, Cherbourg, Southampton. There, guarded by U.S. troops, they boarded Liberty ships bound for an unknown world across the Atlantic. Most of them had never seen the ocean before. The voyage lasted 10 to 14 days. The men slept in bunks stacked 5 high, ate army rations, and stared at the endless water through portholes. They talked quietly among themselves. Where were they being taken? Would they ever see home again? As they approached the American coastline, something remarkable happened. Instead of bombed-out cities, they saw shining harbors, bridges, and factories that stretched as far as the eye could see. No ruins, no smoke, just movement. Cranes loading ships, trains rolling on schedule, cars gliding down wide roads. For the first time, many German prisoners realized that the war had never truly reached America's shores. Here was a country untouched by destruction, a land of steel, light, and abundance. When they disembarked, the prisoners were greeted not with hostility, but with order. Military police directed them into lines, processed them efficiently, and sent them to camps across the country: Texas, Iowa, Georgia, Nebraska, Arizona. They were stunned by the sheer distance. America seemed endless. Each camp was enclosed by barbed wire, guarded by watchtowers, but inside, the conditions were humane. Barracks were clean. There were mess halls, showers, even libraries. For men who had marched through the frozen forests of the Ardennes, it felt almost surreal. One former POW later wrote in his memoir, "We had lost the war, but in America, we found our humanity again." Many of the American guards were young men too, some barely older than the prisoners they watched. They were farm boys from Kansas, mechanics from Detroit, students from New York. The conversations were cautious at first, but curiosity soon replaced fear. The guards realized that these Germans were not monsters. They were men who had fought for a cause they didn't fully choose. And the Germans, in turn, began to see America not as the enemy, but as a mystery. Back in Germany, Allied bombers still roared overhead. Families searched for missing sons. Cities lay in ruins. But across the ocean, the same young men who had fought under the swastika were now tasting freedom's paradox: confinement inside a land of prosperity. It was a strange captivity, one that challenged everything they had been taught. In the evenings, the camps were filled with quiet music from harmonicas or violins smuggled through Red Cross parcels. Some prisoners wrote letters home, others sketched the landscapes of their new surroundings. Endless fields, open skies, rows of corn and cotton. A few began to dream of what life might be like if they could stay. To the Americans, these men were prisoners. To the Germans, this was the first glimpse of a different world, a world built not on conquest but on cooperation and technology. The sheer organization of the camps, the food distribution, the machinery, even the vehicles, revealed something about America that few Europeans had imagined. Its industrial power, precise, efficient, and seemingly limitless. This was not the land of chaos they had been told to hate. This was a nation powered by factories that never slept, by workers, men and women, who could build ships faster than Germany could sink them. The prisoners whispered among themselves, wondering how such a force could exist. For now they were captives, but their story of discovery, of shock, of transformation was just beginning. The barbed wire would hold their bodies, but not their eyes. Through those fences, they would witness the might of American industry and begin to understand how a democracy could outproduce an empire. As one German sergeant later said, decades after the war, "When I arrived in America, I thought I was coming to my enemy's land. When I left, I realized I had seen the future." By the early summer of 1944, the war had changed direction. The Allies were moving east, pushing the German army back through France and Belgium. On the Western Front, tens of thousands of German soldiers had laid down their weapons. Now, stripped of their insignia and waiting under guard, they were no longer warriors, they were prisoners. What none of them yet understood was that they were about to make one of the strangest voyages of the entire war. A journey not to Siberia or a concentration camp, but across an ocean, to a country they had only known through propaganda posters and radio lies. At the ports of Cherbourg, Le Havre, and Southampton, lines of weary prisoners stood under the watchful eyes of American guards. They were fingerprinted, tagged, and loaded onto Liberty ships, the same steel vessels that carried tanks, ammunition, and food to Europe just weeks before. Now they would carry men, captured soldiers of the Reich, to America. Each ship could hold over 2,000 prisoners. The voyage would take up to 2 weeks. For many Germans, it was their first time seeing the sea. The endless gray water stretched to the horizon, and the cold Atlantic air bit through their thin uniforms. Before departure, military chaplains walked the decks, reading short prayers. Few of the prisoners listened. Most stared silently at the fading coastline, at the last glimpse of Europe, a continent torn apart by their own war. Behind them, Germany was collapsing. Ahead lay uncertainty. Inside the ships, space was tight. The men slept in bunks stacked 5 high, in air thick with sweat, diesel, and fear. They were guarded but not mistreated. American sailors, hardened by years of war, treated the prisoners with a mixture of caution and curiosity. Some offered cigarettes or food. A few even tried to practice German words they had picked up from pamphlets or films. Food came 3 times a day. Canned meat, bread, coffee, the same rations the crew ate. It was far more than many had seen during the final months of war in Europe. "They fed us like we were their own soldiers," one POW later recalled. "It was the first time I realized we were in the hands of people who valued discipline, not hatred." At night, the ocean became their universe. The hum of engines and the steady roll of waves lulled some into uneasy sleep, while others lay awake, haunted by memories of home, of bombings, of comrades who would never return. In one corner, a young soldier from Bavaria played an old folk tune on a harmonica he'd hidden in his pocket. The melody drifted through the darkened hold, quieting the whispers. For a moment, even the guards stopped to listen. It was a small sound of humanity in a sea of uncertainty. Above deck, the world was vast and indifferent. The convoy sailed under constant threat. German U-boats still prowled the Atlantic, and every man aboard knew that a single torpedo could end them all, prisoners and guards alike. But the convoys were heavily protected now, and the Allies ruled the sea. The days passed slowly, marked by routines. Roll call, meals, short walks on deck. For the first time, many Germans saw American power up close. The ships were immense, the supply lines endless. On the horizon, dozens of vessels moved in perfect coordination. Transports, destroyers, supply ships. It was an industrial miracle in motion. One prisoner, once a naval officer himself, whispered to his bunkmate, "If this is what their logistics look like, no wonder we lost the war." His words hung heavy in the air. The myth of Nazi superiority was sinking one wave at a time. Days turned into weeks. The ocean grew warmer as they neared the American coast. Rumors spread through the ship that they were bound for Texas, for Georgia, for some vast camp in the desert. None of them had ever seen America, yet each imagined it differently. Some thought it would be full of skyscrapers and machines. Others expected hatred and revenge. Then, one morning, a cry rang out from the deck, "Land! Land ahead!" The prisoners rushed to the portholes. Through the mist, they saw something they could hardly believe. A skyline untouched by war. New York Harbor shimmered under the sun. Ships moved calmly in every direction. Docks stretched endlessly, filled with cranes, trucks, and cargo. In the distance stood the Statue of Liberty, shining like something from another world. For men who had spent years surrounded by ruins, the sight was overwhelming. One soldier later wrote in his diary, "We had been told America was decadent, lazy, weak. But as we entered that harbor, I saw the truth. A power built not on destruction, but on creation." The prisoners were silent. Even the guards seemed to sense the weight of the moment. There was no cheering, no anger, just quiet astonishment. The war had destroyed much of Europe, but here the factories ran day and night, the trains rolled, and the people moved with purpose. After docking, the men were lined up and marched down the gangplanks. American military police recorded their names and sent them to trains waiting nearby. The rail cars were clean, the windows open to fresh air. As the trains rolled westward, the prisoners looked out at green fields, small towns, and children waving at them from crossings. They had been told they were monsters, but the faces outside the train were not filled with fear, only curiosity. One young guard, an American from Iowa, passed down the aisle with a smile and said, "You'll be working soon. Better get used to the sunshine." The prisoners didn't know whether to laugh or remain silent. Sunshine, it felt like something they hadn't seen in years. Their destination was still unknown, but the journey had already changed them. The Atlantic had washed away more than distance. It had begun to strip away illusions. They had crossed not just an ocean, but a line between two worlds, from a continent of ruin to a nation bursting with energy and confidence. For some, the crossing was terrifying. For others, it was the beginning of something unexpected: respect, even admiration, for a former enemy. Years later, many of those same men would say that their transformation began there, on that ship, halfway between war and peace, between the past and the future. As the trains carried them deeper into the heart of America, they couldn't know what awaited them behind the barbed wire. But they knew one thing already. The land they had feared was not the land they had imagined. The journey across the Atlantic had delivered them, not just to captivity, but to a revelation. The long train journey ended in the middle of nowhere, or so it seemed to the prisoners staring out of the windows. Rows of barbed wire glistened in the sunlight. Guard towers rose above the fields. Wooden barracks stretched into the distance. This was their new world, America behind the barbed wire. For thousands of captured German soldiers, their arrival in the United States marked the beginning of a strange captivity, one unlike anything they could have imagined. They were not entering a dungeon or a labor camp. They were entering a world of order, discipline, and, unexpectedly, decency. At Camp Swift in Texas, Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, and dozens of other sites across the country, trucks rolled in carrying the new prisoners. The camps were enormous, often holding between 3,000 and 5,000 men. American guards greeted them briskly, checked identification tags, and assigned barracks. The air smelled of pine wood, dust, and cooking food. To the prisoners, everything felt surreal. The guards were calm. There was no shouting, no beatings, no humiliation. For men who had survived the Eastern Front or the chaos of surrender, it was like stepping into another world. Each man was issued bedding, clean clothes, and a metal tray for meals. Inside the barracks, there were rows of bunks, small stoves for heating, and electric lights that worked every night. For some, it was the first time in years they could sleep without fear of bombing or hunger. Meals were served 3 times a day: meat, vegetables, bread, coffee. The same rations that fed American soldiers. One POW later wrote, "We had expected revenge. What we found was efficiency." Even in captivity, the Americans followed their rules. The camps operated like small cities. There were hospitals, workshops, and even theaters. Prisoners were allowed to organize classes: mathematics, English, history, even music. Red Cross packages brought books, instruments, and paper for letters. Some evenings, the sound of an orchestra floated through the fences. Violins, accordions, a trumpet echoing in the warm American night. The guards often paused to listen. It was hard to imagine that only months earlier, these men had been enemies on the battlefield. For security, the camps were surrounded by tall fences and watchtowers manned by armed guards. Floodlights illuminated the perimeter at night, and escape attempts were rare. Not because the prisoners were afraid of being shot, though that risk was real, but because there was nowhere to go. Beyond the barbed wire stretched endless miles of farmland and desert. Yet, within those fences, a new kind of freedom began to grow. The Americans allowed the prisoners to work, picking fruit, cutting timber, repairing roads, or helping farmers with harvests. For this, they were paid small wages in camp coupons that could be used to buy soap, tobacco, or writing supplies. Work gave the men purpose and dignity. It also exposed them to ordinary American life. When POWs went to nearby farms, they saw families working side by side. Men, women, even children, all free, all equal under the same law. They saw tractors larger than any they'd known in Europe, barns filled with grain, and roads that seemed to stretch forever. Many realized that America's strength was not just in its weapons, but in its organization and abundance. In Texas, farmers often greeted the German workers with cautious smiles. "You boys work hard," they'd say, handing out water or sandwiches. Over time, fear gave way to familiarity. Some locals even invited POWs to share lunch under the shade of a tree. One farmer's wife remembered years later. They were polite, clean, and respectful. "I looked at them and thought, they're just boys, someone's sons, just like ours overseas." Inside the camps, a quiet transformation began. The prisoners compared what they saw around them, the fairness of treatment, the vastness of the land, the stability of daily life, with what they had known under the Nazi regime. Propaganda had told them that America was corrupt and chaotic. But the reality was order, prosperity, and tolerance. Some prisoners began to question everything they had believed. They formed discussion groups, reading about democracy and economics. Camp newspapers printed articles about world events, some written by the POWs themselves. American officers encouraged education, hoping to prepare the men for a peaceful return to post-war Europe. Of course, not everyone accepted this new perspective. Among the prisoners were die-hard Nazis who tried to maintain control, threatening anyone who spoke favorably of the Americans. Secret meetings were held at night, loyalty oaths whispered in the dark. But the war was over, and even those most devoted to Hitler could feel the collapse of that old world pressing down on them. In one camp in Arizona, a group of prisoners tore down the swastika flag they had secretly hung in their barracks. "No more of that," one said quietly. "It brought us nothing but ruin." There were moments of tension, small fights, escape attempts, even tragic shootings when men misjudged the fence lines. But overall, the system worked. American discipline, combined with fairness, turned enemies into workers, and workers into witnesses of something greater, the sheer scale of the United States. Everywhere they looked, the prisoners saw evidence of America's industrial power. Trains thundered past carrying coal and steel. Trucks moved in endless convoys. Factories smoked in the distance, their output seemingly limitless. Many of these men, trained engineers and mechanics themselves, were stunned by the organization behind it all. One German officer later said, "In Germany, everything was collapsing. In America, everything was growing. It was the first time I understood what real power looked like." Life behind the barbed wire was still captivity, but it was also a kind of revelation. The men were safe, fed, and treated humanely, and in that safety they began to see the difference between tyranny and democracy. Letters home reflected that change. Some wrote cautiously, describing good treatment. Others went further, confessing that the Americans were not monsters but models of efficiency and strength. Many ended their letters with a single line, "We are alive, and we are learning." As months turned into years, the fences rusted slightly under the American sun, but inside, life continued, with study, work, laughter, and reflection. Behind those wires, thousands of men quietly began to rebuild themselves, piece by piece. When freedom finally came, many would leave America with something unexpected: respect. Respect for a nation that had defeated them not only with bombs and bullets, but with order, fairness, and faith in its own principles. The barbed wire had kept them contained, but it could not stop them from seeing. And what they saw behind those fences would stay with them for the rest of their lives. By 1944, the war was still raging overseas, but deep in the heart of America, a quieter battle was being fought. A battle of production, organization, and endurance. While millions of American soldiers fought across Europe and the Pacific, their homeland had become an engine, a living machine of industry. And now, inside that machine, behind fences and under watchtowers, thousands of German prisoners of war were about to take part in it. For many German POWs, work assignments were the first real glimpse into the everyday life of America. Under the Geneva Convention, the United States was allowed to use prisoners for non-military labor, and America needed hands. The war had drawn millions of men into the armed forces, leaving farms and factories short of workers. So the captives were put to work, not in chains but under contracts. They picked cotton in Texas, harvested corn in Iowa, chopped timber in the forests of Oregon, and packed fruit in California. Some repaired roads or worked in sawmills. Others cleaned rail yards or loaded supply trains. Each earned small wages in camp coupons. It was hard, honest labor, and it brought the prisoners face to face with the power of American production. At Camp Huntsville, Texas, German POWs were bused daily to nearby sawmills. There, they worked beside civilians, often older men or women whose sons were away at war. The Germans were astonished to see American women driving tractors, operating cranes and welding steel. In Germany, a woman's place was in the home, one prisoner said later. Here, she built airplanes. To the prisoners, these sights were deeply unsettling and inspiring. The propaganda they had grown up with described America as lazy, divided, and decadent. But in front of them was a nation united by purpose. Everywhere they looked, something was being built. Planes, tanks, ships, trucks, the tools of freedom. The prisoners began to call these places Die Fabriken der Freiheit, the factories of freedom. Inside the factories, the rhythm never stopped. 12-hour shifts, day and night, fueled by coffee, sweat, and determination. Conveyor belts carried parts from one end to another. Sparks flew from welding torches. The air was thick with oil, dust, and music from tin radios. Sometimes POWs were assigned to clean the floors or move materials. Though they weren't allowed near classified areas, they could see enough to be astonished. Machines operated with a precision and speed they'd never seen before. American engineers worked from detailed blueprints, and even the smallest part was numbered, labeled, and logged. One former Luftwaffe mechanic later wrote, "We realized then that America's real weapon was not its army, but its industry, its ability to make, to organize, to outproduce the world." Many prisoners came from industrial backgrounds, machinists, electricians, carpenters, and they couldn't help but compare. In Germany, factories had been bombed, supplies scarce, morale broken. Here, machines were new, the floors clean, and workers well-fed. It was not the chaos of a nation at war, but the order of a nation determined to win. In rural areas, the impact was just as striking. The POWs worked on farms that stretched farther than they could see. American tractors were larger than any they'd known, running smoothly on gasoline rather than horsepower. Barns overflowed with grain. Irrigation systems turned dry soil into lush fields. A Bavarian farmer-turned-soldier wrote in his journal, "They have more food here than we could imagine. Even their animals live better than many of our people did." The prisoners learned to work alongside American civilians, many of whom treated them not as enemies but as laborers, sometimes even as guests. Farmers often provided cold drinks, sandwiches, or cigarettes during breaks. Some women, seeing the young faces of the POWs, felt pity rather than anger. The rules were clear: no direct contact, no fraternization. But humanity has a way of crossing fences. Small gestures, a wave, a smile, a few English words, built silent bridges. One American farmer's daughter recalled decades later, "They were polite, quiet, always saying thank you. I was just a girl, but I remember thinking they didn't look like enemies. They looked like boys who'd seen too much." As the months passed, many POWs began to see the contrast between the propaganda that had shaped them and the reality around them. They saw black and white workers laboring side by side. They saw women managing farms and factories. They saw freedom not as chaos, but as cooperation. Even under guard, they could sense it. America's power came not from fear, but from unity. Inside the camps, discussions grew more serious. Men talked late into the night about what they had seen, the scale of the factories, the fairness of pay, the efficiency of systems. They began to understand that democracy, though messy, could be stronger than dictatorship. For many, this realization was painful, but it planted a seed that would grow long after the war ended. By 1945, as the war neared its end, the prisoners' work became even more essential. They filled labor gaps, repaired roads for returning troops, and helped gather the harvest that would feed both America and post-war Europe. Their contribution was small in the grand scale of history, but significant enough that farmers and factory owners later wrote letters of gratitude to the War Department. Some POWs even received personal thank you notes from local communities. In Kansas, one town raised money to send books and soap to their former German workers after the war ended. It was a strange irony. Men who had once served a brutal regime were now helping sustain the economy of a free nation, and discovering, in the process, the dignity of honest work. When they looked back through the barbed wire at night, the factory's lights glowed on the horizon, silent constellations of progress. To many, those lights came to symbolize something powerful, a future where strength was measured not by conquest, but by creation. One former prisoner would later write simply, "In America, I learned that work could be freedom, not slavery. It was the greatest lesson of my life." The war would soon end, and the prisoners would return to a broken homeland. But the memory of what they had seen, the order, the scale, the humanity of American industry, would remain with them forever. For these men, the factories of freedom were more than places of labor. They were classrooms, living demonstrations of what a free and united nation could build when it believed in itself. For the German prisoners scattered across America, the first months were filled with confusion and disbelief. They had been soldiers of a nation that claimed to be the most advanced in the world, the land of engineering, of discipline, of precision. But what they were seeing now, from behind the fences of their camps and on their work assignments, shattered that illusion completely. They were witnessing something they had never imagined, a country whose power seemed to stretch endlessly, across land, across sky, across the very rhythm of daily life. Each day, buses and trucks carried the prisoners from their camps to the fields, sawmills, and construction sites. As they traveled through rural America, they passed vast highways, towns lit up at night, farms equipped with machinery they'd never seen before. Everywhere, there was motion. Trains hauling coal, convoys of trucks loaded with goods, endless lines of power cables stretching to the horizon. The Germans whispered among themselves, "How can this be? How can one country have so much?" Even those who had studied engineering or logistics struggled to comprehend it. The American economy had become a force of nature, not by order of a dictator, but by cooperation, invention, and sheer willpower. In just a few short years, the United States had produced more planes, tanks, and ships than all the Axis nations combined. The prisoners didn't need statistics to see it. They saw it every day. In one small Texas town, a group of POWs helped repair a section of railroad. As they worked, train after train thundered past, each one longer than the last. Oil tankers, grain cars, flatbeds loaded with jeeps and tractors. The line never seemed to end. A young German lieutenant turned to his companion and said quietly, "We could bomb for 100 years and never stop this." For many, the moment of realization came when they were allowed to work inside or near factories. Even from the outside, the scale was overwhelming. Massive steel buildings with smokestacks reaching into the sky, conveyor belts moving with mechanical precision, trucks arriving and departing in perfect rhythm. They had seen German factories during the war, often running on scraps, operating in the shadows after Allied bombings. But here, the American plants roared day and night, illuminated by floodlights, running with an energy that felt unstoppable. One former Luftwaffe mechanic later recalled, "In Germany, we believed we had the world's finest machines. But in America, the machines never stopped. It was like watching an empire of motion." The POWs began to understand that America's secret weapon was not just technology, it was organization. Everything worked because everyone worked together. Farmers, housewives, engineers, truck drivers, students, all moving toward a single goal. It was hard to believe that this same country had once been dismissed by Nazi propaganda as soft, lazy, and decadent. Here, they saw efficiency that rivaled any military machine, but driven not by fear, rather by confidence. Even the smallest things astonished them. The abundance of food in grocery stores, the smoothness of the roads, the size of the cars. At camp kitchens, the coffee never ran out. Bread came in thick white loaves, soft and perfect. Butter, sugar, fruit, things that had become rare luxuries in wartime Europe, were part of every meal. The POWs wrote home about it cautiously, careful not to sound too impressed. But between the lines, their amazement showed. We are well. We are fed. They have everything here. Everything. For many, the turning point was seeing the vast agricultural operations of the Midwest. Fields that stretched for miles, dotted with tractors, grain silos, irrigation canals. They saw how easily American farmers could feed not just a nation, but armies across oceans. A former sergeant who had once worked on a small farm in Bavaria later wrote, "In Germany, we worked with our hands and horses. In America, machines did the labor of 100 men. I realized then why we had lost. The shock was not only technological, it was moral. These prisoners had been taught that a society ruled by freedom and equality would collapse under its own weakness. Yet what they saw was the opposite. Freedom here had not destroyed order, it had created it. They saw black and white workers standing shoulder to shoulder in the factories. They saw women operating cranes and driving trucks. They saw managers who spoke to workers as equals. The discipline did not come from fear of punishment. It came from pride, from the belief that every person mattered in the greater effort. To men raised under a totalitarian system, this realization was staggering. They began to understand that America's might was built not on submission, but on shared purpose. One POW teacher later told his students back in Germany, "We thought freedom was weakness, but in America I learned that freedom was strength, the kind that builds, not destroys." The shock of scale extended beyond the material. The prisoners began to feel a psychological shift, a quiet respect for the very nation that had defeated them. They didn't admire its weapons. They admired its spirit. Even under guard, they saw that the Americans were not ruled by fear. Their society ran because it believed in itself. Some nights, standing by the fences, the prisoners would watch the headlights of passing trucks on the highways beyond. Miles of light in motion. It looked to them like the bloodstream of a living giant, a country too vast, too alive to ever be conquered. There were moments of silence, of deep reflection. Men who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler now stared into the American distance and saw something far greater. A civilization driven by innovation, by cooperation, by faith in progress. Years later, many of those same men would tell their children about the shock they felt, the moment they realized how completely they had misunderstood the world. A former POW summed it up simply, "I came to America a soldier of the Reich. I left as a student of freedom." For them, the United States was more than a victorious enemy. It was a mirror showing what humanity could achieve when it built instead of destroyed, when it believed in work instead of war. Behind the fences, they had seen the soul of a nation, and it left them humbled, changed, and filled with questions about their own future. By 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end. Across the American landscape, hundreds of POW camps still held more than 400,000 German prisoners, men who had once fought for a regime built on lies. But behind the barbed wire, something extraordinary was happening. A different kind of campaign, one not of weapons, but of words. This was Operation Special Projects, the U.S. Army's quiet mission to change minds. The goal was simple yet ambitious: to introduce German prisoners to democratic values, to expose them to truth, and to help them unlearn the ideology of Nazism. It was not called propaganda. The Americans had learned that forced persuasion rarely worked. Instead, they would teach with patience, books, and example. The process began slowly. In the camps, bulletin boards were replaced with reading corners. Newspapers in German appeared Der Ruf, the Call, edited by German-speaking POWs who had rejected Nazism. The articles spoke of freedom, justice, and the rebuilding of Germany, ideas that had been buried under years of dictatorship. At first, many prisoners ignored them. Some called the writers traitors. Others laughed, dismissing it all as American propaganda. But curiosity is hard to contain. Soon, men began to read, quietly, secretly, trying to understand the words they'd once been forbidden to hear. In Camp Crossville, Tennessee, lectures were held on history and civics. American officers explained how their government worked, the separation of powers, the freedom of the press, the right to vote. For men raised in a system where obedience was virtue, the concept of disagreement, of lawful dissent, was revolutionary. One German sergeant, once an ardent Nazi, later recalled, "We were told democracy was chaos, but here I saw order without fear. I saw people free to speak, yet still united." Education programs spread quickly. Prisoners were offered classes in English, mathematics, journalism, even philosophy. Those who volunteered could earn certificates recognized back in Germany. The American officers noticed that learning did more than fill time. It restored dignity. Men who had been indoctrinated to follow orders were now learning to think again. At night, the camp libraries filled with men hunched over books. Goethe, Thomas Mann, Mark Twain, and Steinbeck. They read about freedom and responsibility, about injustice and redemption. For many, it was their first contact with ideas that had been banned by their own government. Films also played a role. In makeshift theaters, the prisoners watched American movies, newsreels of liberated concentration camps, documentaries about democracy, and stories of ordinary people overcoming hardship. The images were devastating. For many, it was the first time they saw what their country had done in places like Buchenwald and Dachau. Silence often filled the rooms after the screenings. Some wept, some turned away. Others sat motionless, unable to speak. A camp interpreter later described one evening. After the film ended, no one moved. The guards didn't speak. For the first time, they saw the truth, not as rumor, but as undeniable fact. The re-education was not about humiliation. The Americans knew that guilt alone could not rebuild a nation. What mattered was understanding, helping these men see that there was another way to live, another way to believe. So, rather than lectures about guilt, the classes focused on responsibility, on what a person could do differently in the future. The message was clear. You were deceived, but now you can choose. In many camps, discussion circles were formed. Former teachers, journalists, and pastors among the POWs began leading debates. Topics ranged from, "What is democracy?" to, "How can Germany be rebuilt?" The debates were heated, often emotional. But slowly, new voices began to emerge. Voices of reason, of empathy, of hope. Some American officers were deeply moved by the transformation they witnessed. At Camp Fort Devens, Massachusetts, one officer wrote in his report, "They came here as soldiers of tyranny. They will leave as students of liberty." By 1946, the war was over, but the re-education continued. The U.S. government encouraged anti-Nazi prisoners to help guide others. Many of these men became teachers and translators. Some worked on Der Ruf, which grew from a camp newspaper into a respected post-war publication in Germany. Through these programs, a quiet revolution was taking place. Ideas were crossing fences, ideas about truth, equality, and moral courage. And perhaps the most powerful teacher of all was not a book or a film, but the behavior of the Americans themselves. The guards who treated them fairly, the officers who spoke respectfully, the farmers who offered them a meal after work. These small acts of decency left lasting marks on men who had been taught to see their enemies as monsters. One former prisoner wrote years later, "It was not what they said, it was how they lived. They proved that a free people could also be strong, stronger than any dictator's army." The re-education program was not perfect. Some prisoners remained defiant to the end. Others accepted new ideas only to survive. But for thousands, it worked. By the time they were repatriated to Germany, many carried with them a vision of a different kind of homeland, one that could be rebuilt on democracy rather than domination. Historians later noted that several post-war German leaders, teachers, mayors, journalists, had once been POWs in America. They brought back with them the lessons learned behind the wire: tolerance, civic duty, the value of freedom. In the end, the re-education was not about turning enemies into friends. It was about giving men back their humanity, something both sides had lost in the chaos of war. When the time came to go home, many left with mixed feelings: relief, gratitude, and a quiet sense of awakening. They had come to America as soldiers of a fallen regime. They left as witnesses, living proof that even in captivity, the mind could be liberated. One former POW summed it up best: "The Americans captured my body, but they freed my mind." By 1945, the war was over, at least in Europe. But in the quiet fields of America, behind fences now growing rusty with time, another kind of peace was being made, not through treaties or speeches, but through small acts of kindness. The German prisoners who had once arrived as enemies were beginning to experience something they had never expected: friendship. At first, it seemed impossible. These men had fought under the swastika, sworn loyalty to a regime that preached hatred. Yet here they were, thousands of miles from home, working side by side with the very people they had been told to despise. The early days were tense. Townsfolk watched from a distance as the prisoners arrived, guarded by American soldiers, wearing faded uniforms marked PW. Many expected hostility, but over time, barriers began to crumble. On the farms of Texas, Iowa, and Georgia, POWs labored through the seasons, planting, harvesting, repairing barns. Farmers, desperate for help, began to see them not as enemies but as young men simply trying to survive the war. One farmer in Arkansas later recalled, "At first I was scared of them. Nazis, they said. But after a week, I saw they were just boys, polite, grateful to be alive." The POWs worked hard, often exceeding expectations. They were paid in camp coupons and treated according to the Geneva Convention, but what mattered most to them was the respect they received. In many communities, kindness replaced suspicion. Farmers' wives would bring pitchers of lemonade to the fields. Children would wave as the trucks passed by. Some even left small gifts at the fence: apples, cigarettes, letters written in shaky English. The guards usually turned a blind eye. They, too, had come to see these men not as enemies, but as workers, as humans. One story, often told in local histories, comes from Camp Algona, Iowa. During Christmas of 1944, the German prisoners there built a life-size nativity scene out of wood and plaster. They worked secretly for weeks, carving the figures with remarkable skill. When Christmas Eve arrived, they placed it near the camp chapel, visible from the road. The townspeople were stunned. Families drove in from miles away to see the display. It was a moment of shared faith, a German creation standing peacefully on American soil. That night, American guards and German prisoners sang together across the fence. Still nacked, silent night. For a brief moment, there were no sides, no war, only humanity. Similar moments unfolded all across the country. In Nebraska, POWs helped rebuild a church that had burned down. In Oregon, they volunteered to fight a forest fire, saving the town that had once feared them. In Georgia, a farmer's wife taught German prisoners how to bake cornbread. They, in return, built her a new chicken coop. Each story echoed the same quiet truth, that even in captivity, compassion could take root. Some friendships deepened into something lasting. When the war ended and the prisoners were sent home, many Americans wrote letters to them, and to their surprise, letters came back. Despite the ocean between them, friendships endured for decades. One woman from Kansas kept a postcard from a former POW for the rest of her life. It read simply, "You showed me that enemies can be friends. You changed how I see the world." For the prisoners, these acts of kindness were transformative. Many had been raised in a world that taught them to distrust and dehumanize. Now, they were learning that respect and decency could exist even between former foes. A German soldier from Camp Tonkawa later said, "In America, I learned that strength could be gentle. It was the first time I felt the meaning of peace." The American guards, too, were changed. Many were young men barely older than the prisoners. They discovered that discipline didn't require cruelty. Some guards even shared meals or played soccer with the POWs. Unofficially, of course, but with quiet understanding. One sergeant wrote in his diary, "They follow orders, they work hard, and they miss home just like we do. It's hard to hate a man who laughs at your jokes." After the war, when the German prisoners were finally repatriated, farewells were emotional. Farmers and guards came to the train stations to see them off. There were handshakes, tears, and promises to write. One farmer's wife in Louisiana gave her departing worker a Bible with his name written inside. He carried it back to Germany, a symbol of grace in a world that had known too much hate. In some cases, the connections led to reunions years later. Former POWs returned to visit the American families who had treated them kindly. They brought gifts, carved wooden toys, photographs, stories. For both sides, it was as if the war had never been between them at all. These friendships did not erase the horrors of war, but they proved something powerful, that humanity could survive even in its shadow. The fences that had divided them became, in time, symbols of what could be overcome. Historians would later call this the quiet reconciliation. While politicians debated peace in Europe, ordinary people, farmers, guards, prisoners, were living it quietly and sincerely across the fields of America. Many of the former POWs who returned to Germany carried those experiences deep in their hearts. They spoke of America not as a conqueror, but as a teacher, a place where they had seen humanity at its best. Some became advocates for democracy, for forgiveness, for cooperation. A few even named their children after the American friends who had once treated them with kindness. One man from Bavaria, who had worked on a Kansas farm, wrote decades later, "In America, I learned that kindness is stronger than any army. That lesson shaped the rest of my life. Friendships and humanity, these were not weapons of war, but of peace. They did what bombs and armies never could. They changed hearts." And as those men sailed back across the Atlantic, carrying with them the memories of open skies, warm meals, and unexpected compassion, they knew that something inside them had changed forever. They had come as soldiers, they left as men, and the world would be different because of it. By 1946, the time had come. The war was over, the camps were emptying, and thousands of German prisoners of war began their long journey home, across the same Atlantic Ocean that had once carried them into captivity. For many, the departure was bittersweet. America had been a strange refuge, a place of order, food, and quiet dignity. Now they were returning to a homeland they no longer recognized, a nation reduced to rubble and silence. The ships that carried them home were crowded, gray, and silent. Men leaned against the railings, staring across the water, lost in thought. Some carried small souvenirs, a book, a photograph, a Bible given by an American family. Others carried nothing but memories. One former prisoner later wrote, "We left America with mixed hearts. We were free, but we were going home to nothing." When the ships arrived at ports in France and the British-occupied zones, the men disembarked under Allied supervision. From there, trains carried them east, into a Germany that barely existed anymore. As the trains rolled through the countryside, the returning soldiers looked out the windows in disbelief. The towns they remembered were gone. Roofs collapsed, streets filled with rubble, bridges twisted like bones. Smoke still rose from bombed-out factories. The stations were crowded with refugees, widows, and hungry children. The smell of ashes and cold earth hung in the air. For those who had spent years in the relative comfort of American camps, the shock was overwhelming. Many had been well-fed, sheltered, even educated while in captivity. Now they faced a homeland starving and broken. A former POW from Camp Huntsville wrote in his journal, "I had been a prisoner in America, but now I was a prisoner of ruins." Families were scattered. Some men arrived home to find their houses destroyed, their parents dead, their wives remarried, their towns divided by occupation zones. Others discovered that their loved ones had vanished, victims of bombings or the chaos of Germany's collapse. The emotional weight was unbearable. And yet, amidst the devastation, something inside them had changed. The years in America had planted a seed, a quiet belief in rebuilding, in freedom, in the idea that dignity did not come from domination, but from cooperation. Those who had been part of the re-education programs found themselves thinking differently from the comrades they met upon return. They had seen another way of life, one built not on fear, but on fairness. In some towns, they spoke cautiously of what they had learned. They told stories of American farms, of libraries, of kindness from former enemies. At first, few wanted to hear it. The wounds were too fresh, the shame too deep. But slowly, their words began to matter. One former POW named Hans, who had worked on an Iowa farm, became a teacher in Bavaria. In his classroom, he told his students about the democracy he had witnessed. "In America," he said, "I saw freedom with order. That is what we must build here." Others took up similar missions. Former prisoners became journalists, pastors, city officials, ordinary men shaping a new Germany from the ashes. They had seen the truth, that hatred had destroyed their nation, and only humanity could rebuild it. In the Western zones, the Allied occupation authorities encouraged this spirit. The experiences of former POWs were quietly valued. Their understanding of democracy and their first-hand experience with American ideals became part of the foundation for a new civil society. But the transition was not easy. Many returned POWs were met with suspicion. Some were accused of becoming Americanized, even traitorous. Others struggled with guilt. Guilt for surviving while millions had perished. Guilt for once believing in a system that had brought so much suffering. One man described it as a prison without walls. Yet, amidst that despair, they carried something powerful, a belief that change was possible. They had seen how education, compassion, and hard work could rebuild lives. They began applying those lessons to their shattered homeland. They formed cooperatives, started schools, rebuilt bridges and farms. In towns across the Western zones, the spirit of rebuilding began quietly, brick by brick, day by day. And for many, the memories of kindness from across the ocean guided them. Letters continued to arrive from America, from farmers, guards, and families who still remembered their German workers. Packages of food and clothing came through international aid. It was as if the humanity shown during captivity was now being returned, multiplied. One former POW received a package containing a note. "You helped us once. Now let us help you. For men who had seen the worst of human cruelty, this generosity was almost unbearable. It confirmed what they had learned behind the wire, that decency could outlast hatred. As the 1940s turned to the 1950s, many of these former prisoners watched a new Germany begin to rise, democratic, prosperous, at peace with its neighbors. And though history would rarely mention them, their quiet influence was everywhere. A historian later wrote, "The men who returned from America brought home not just survival, but an idea that freedom and responsibility could live side by side." For those men, the ruins of their homeland were not just a symbol of defeat, but of rebirth. They had seen destruction. Now they would build. They had seen tyranny. Now they would choose freedom. Years later, when they spoke of their time as prisoners, many did not talk of fences or guards, but of the lessons they had learned. Lessons about kindness, fairness, and faith in humanity. One former POW summed it up simply, "I came home to ruins, but inside me, America had built something that could never be destroyed." The return to Germany was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of a new one, a story of men who carried fragments of freedom back into a nation that needed it most. They had left their homeland as soldiers. They returned as witnesses, and through their memories, through their quiet work and words, they helped lay the first stones of a different future.